The listeners are just as important as the teller. I like this saying, if there's no one there to listen to the story, did the story even really get told?
Hello, I'm Tom Hackett, and this is my podcast about the ancient art of storytelling. Here we discuss the origins and evolution of stories through ancient mythology, legends, and oral traditions. Because every story has a story. This is episode 2 of my interview with Kenthen Thomas, teacher, educator, and knowledge sharer. We're discussing James Tate, the anthropologist who recorded many interior Salish mythologies. But as we discussed in the previous episode, having all these massive collections of texts is good for recording, but not for understanding the oral traditions. Every individual tells a story in a different way. The same story can represent a single person or an entire community. Some oral stories belong to families, carefully handed down from generation to generation, dating back thousands of years. Each telling takes on its own meaning through the language, narration, and storytelling skills of the presenter. Writing the stories down, often through a translator, is a static preservation of the story in time. But oral traditions are meant to be fluid and dynamic. They shift and evolve. They have multiple meanings, depending on how they are told and who they are being told to. But without recording the stories, some of them likely would have been lost during the dark days of the residential school systems. Is it better to have a recorded version than to lose the story forever? That's so interesting. We talked about James Tate earlier, having written down, it's exactly like what you say. He wrote down what he heard. How much of that was lost in the translation? How much of that story was forgotten while it was being told that time? And stories are so important, and they're meant to be fluid, right? These oral histories, these oral traditions, they're meant to be fluid and ever-changing, and as they're passed down from generation to generation, they take on a new life of their own, and there's new information being told, with new weather events and new people in the area, and they are kind of meant to be more fluid like that.
And if you think about, James Tate was fluent in Secwepemc Nation. He knew the language really well. He understood when the stories were told to him. But some of the words are so hard to transcribe because they might have 3, 4, 5, 6 different meanings, because our language is 85% action words. They're 85% verbs. And they mean so many different things when you say them and in which context you say them. So to translate that into English, imagine how hard that was for him to do that. Did he mean this, or did he mean that? Or did he mean the 6th meaning? Did he mean the 4th meaning? I'm going to go with the 3rd. He meant the 3rd one. And then he wrote it down in English the best he could. And then he's like, geez, that kind of makes sense. I don't know. I'm still writing to my audience. But I'm taking it from these guys over here, and they're chuckling at me. Yeah.
Dr. Mary Thomas was a highly respected elder of the Secwepemc Nation. She was a famed North American botanist, earning many awards, including a doctorate from the University of Victoria. Growing up, she spent a lot of time with her grandparents, who taught her and her siblings about their heritage. But the joy of childhood changed abruptly when she was shipped off to residential school. There she was forbidden to speak her language, she was beaten, and one of her sisters even died while attending the school. Her self-esteem was shattered, and she was severed from her culture and spirituality. Years later, she was asked to help on a museum project to teach Aboriginal culture. She began interviewing elders in the area and soaked up their knowledge like a sponge. her own memories came flooding back. This period changed her life. The learning eventually turned to teaching. She called this her journey to healing. She was an environmentalist and a devoted teacher who fought to preserve and promote traditional practices as a way to heal the land and its people. Do you have a fear that there's, through the residential school system and different events that have happened, has there been a lot of stories that you think are just lost?
Oh, yeah, that's a hard one, because you look at, I'll use a personal example. Mary, for the longest time, she used to tell us the story about how she hated being an Indian. She even enfranchised, because the Constitution in Canada at the time said that you couldn't be Indian and you couldn't be Canadian at the same time. So you had to choose. And if you wanted to choose to be Canadian, you had to enfranchise. You had to give yourself the right to vote, which meant that you had to give up your Indian status. And she chose not to send any more of her kids to residential school for a couple incidences that happened there. So when she enfranchised, she left to Rutland, and she raised the rest of her children there. And she brought them all up in Rutland, and they lived their life in Rutland. And she hated everything about being an Indian, as she put it. But one day she got back into it because of the Museum of Kelowna wanted some information. They wanted to do a display on Indians at the time. So she went down, they paid her, and she helped out. But she said through her hands and through her work, she was able to start remembering things. And she started going through the muscle memory and putting things back together. And she started remembering memories from her own childhood. And it made her smile and made her laugh. And she realized that she didn't need to do this, hate being an Indian anymore. Because she realized that she needed to keep all this alive for the youth, for the Dekalmuch, so that one day they would see the beauty, the true beauty of being Secwepemc, from the Secwepemc, the true beauty of being Indigenous, and to feel, to touch, to learn, to be able to build things with your hand and to put things together. So she said, I need to put that aside, put that hatred and that anger aside inside of me, and come to terms with my Indigenous, and remember what it felt like to be a young Indigenous, a young lady, a young Secwepemc. And she started remembering her languages. She was a multi-language speaker. She spoke Thompson, she spoke Okanagan, she spoke Shuswap, and I think she even spoke a little bit of Chilcotin. And that's just the way people were way back in the day. They spoke all the languages that surrounded them. And I think she even knew a little bit of Chinook. And she started to fall in love with the whole beauty of our traditions and our cultures. And she passed that along. In her later years, she passed that along to everyone. I think it became just such a passion for her that she loved it. So if you think about that, she's just one person that was in residential school. She was just one person who had children that went to residential school. So if you think of the thousands across Turtle Island that went to residential school, and that didn't come to terms with the beauty of their indigeneity, that had stories with them that they never told, that died with them. Even if it was one story for every 10 people, that's so many of our legends, our stories from all over Turtle Island that went to the next realm with them. So that's a little disheartening for me in a selfish way, because I'll never get to hear them. But in another perspective that I understand is that our teachings come back to us. They're cyclical. We don't live in a perfect circle. We kind of live in a sphere where it compresses and comes back and forth and compresses and it comes back and forth. And those stories and those teachings come back through that sphere, back and forth. And they're never truly lost. They're just put in the earth. They're there for us to rediscover. And this one teacher that I met along my journey in life, Dr. Brown, he talked about this in such a good way. He said that it comes back through the young and through the very, very old, because they're the two at the two edges of the different realms that we go to. On this side, we come from the realm of our ancestors. On this side, we go to the realm of our ancestors. So he said on either side, for a short minute, for a short second, we recall the teachings of our ancestors. And it could be through a story, could be through a song, could be through an action, could be through something. And all of a sudden we'll start doing it. And we'll be like 1 or 2 years old and we won't know what we're doing. We'll be doing something. We'll be singing a song. And then all of a sudden someone hears you and you're only a 2-year-old and they'll go, an elder will hear you and go, geez, I remember a long time ago, my uncle used to sing that song. He used to sing it when we needed to feel better for ourselves. And they'll go, how did that little boy know that song? And then that's the way, is because we're so close to that realm on either side that we don't know why or how, because it pops into us. I've heard of other stories of fully grown men, and they'll be just like, not in a trance, but they'll be just so in such a, well, I guess almost a trance, but they'll be in such a moment, driving or half sleeping in that area between sleep and awake. And all of a sudden a song or a story will come to them, a part of a story, and they'll wake up, they'll start singing it, or they'll start speaking it, or they'll start saying a word, a Secwepemc word, and then they'll go, what was that? And they'll do a little research, and then one of the elders will go, geez, I haven't heard that since I was a young one. Where'd you get that? And then they'll say, oh, I heard it, and I was almost asleep, and then I heard that word come into my ear. Holy, the ancestors are talking to you. But I've heard of things like that, and I always go, gee, wow, what I wouldn't know what to do if that happened to me. I wouldn't even know if I would recognize it, right? Because if I all of a sudden heard a word go in my ear, I don't know and then I said it out loud, I would go, wonder what that was about. And then I'd move on with my life. Everything else would fill up my life, but I wouldn't be that in tune with it, maybe. So I think about that. And I think, yeah, we lost a lot of our stories. We've lost a lot of our knowledge. We don't have it right now. We don't have our knowledge. We don't have our traditions that we once had. But I truly believe that they're just out there. They're out there. Like I'm looking out the window and I see the trees, the leaves, the sun, the sky. I see the connectivity. And we're connected to everything. We just don't know how to reconnect to everything again. Everything that is in this house that surrounds us, this microphone, the TV behind me, your video camera, that's what disconnects us from everything else. So I think, yeah, when we become reconnected, we'll get all of it back. But right now, we'll just have to settle for what we have and be grateful for what we have.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really like that. I really like that imagery too, when you say the older generation with the connecting with the younger generation and those stories that have existed throughout humankind anyways. We all share the same stories. We've got, exactly like you say, now we've got TVs and video cameras and things, but we're still talking the stories, and they're still the same stories that we've talked about for hundreds, thousands of years. Mm-hmm. We're just finding different ways to share them now. Like I even find doing this podcast and podcasts has become something new, but it's just an interesting way to share stories too, because we can share stories with people in New Zealand, even though, if I'm in the Kamloops area, to Kamloops, I can talk to somebody in Asia, and the world is just becoming more connected that way. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to think about, what are the stories now? What are the stories that we're talking about and sharing with each other? Where have they come from? Do we share similar stories? Mm-hmm. And can we create new stories? And then, like you say too, is it repeating something that's already been said in the past? Which most likely it is, because it's human nature in all of us. We've been through that. Yeah. We all experience the same things as we go through life in different ways and in different environments, and people experience different things. But as a human race, they're all kind of emotions and feelings and things we've been through before. And I know I've heard quite a bit too about like 7 generations ahead and 7 generations behind. And you think about the stories that have been shared through those different generations. And even with that, there's been wars and there's been times where population has decreased. So stories would come and go and float through things like that too. Yeah. So that's a really neat way of looking at it. When you said that, it really triggered a lot in me where I was like, oh yeah. Part of what I like to do, even with this podcast, is try to record as many things as I can by people with permission, by people that have the knowledge of it. And then it's there. You can pass it on to somebody and say, here, this could belong to you. It's part of your family or it's part of your history. Maybe it hadn't been told to you yet or, whatever it is, but we'll want to leave it with you. And so it's kind of interesting to think about that too, and how we tell stories now, where they come from, and even writing new stories too, with the knowledge that you gain and creating a story that you think fits into the realm of everything and your experience too, right? Yeah. Essentially, all the stories are written by somebody who's felt an emotion or felt an issue, and they have something to say. So it's interesting that we can lose stories and gain stories and trigger stories and hear stories from the past. And yeah.
It's a very, very human thing. What you were saying at the end there really reminded me of Thomas King, something about stories, when he says, when he finishes a story and he goes, well, now that you heard the story, you can't unhear the story. So you can't say you've never heard the story. Something like that. I'm just paraphrasing him. I can't remember him verbatim, but yeah, pretty much. He would always end off his stories with like, you can do what you want with the story. Sell it to Disney. Make a wood carving out of it. Catch a fish with it. I don't care. But whatever you can do is you can never unhear that story. And I always love that.
Thomas King is a quote machine. And he's a master storyteller. He's a professor and an author of Cherokee and Greek descent. He was the first Massey lecturer to self-identify as Aboriginal. The Truth About Stories, a native narrative, which was later published as a book. The lecture's online if you want to hear more. His writing is a merger between oral and written traditions. He's able to bridge Aboriginal and European American cultures. One of my favorite quotes from King: the truth about stories is, that's all we are. Or, there are no truths, only stories. And one more: we will never have true civilization until we have learned to recognize the rights of others. When you tell a story, what is it that you hope people are going to take away from it?
Well, the way I understand it, and the way that it's been told to me by elders and other storytellers, is that you just tell it in the way that you feel that day. Sometimes you'll show up to the event and you'll be angry. Maybe someone cut you off just when you're going to park your car in the parking lot, and someone cut you off and swore at you and spit on your hood and walked away, and you're like, holy. So you walk in, you meet your person, you shake hands, and you go in the change room and you throw down your bag and you throw on all your garb and your headdress, and you grab your drum and you get out on stage and you fake a smile and you tell it angrily. And the listeners are just as important as the teller, because if I always heard, I like this saying, if there's no one there to listen to the story, did the story even really get told? I tell the story to all of the listeners. And if I'm in a really good mood, or if I'm in a bad mood, or if I'm in just an outright happy mood or whatever, I tell it the way that I feel. And they are just as important because they hear it the way that they feel. They hear it and they make relevance to it. They're the ones who say, holy, when you told that story, boy, I was going through such a hard time in my life that story all of a sudden made sense to me. It made me make a decision. Or sometimes I'll hear things like, boy, I was going through a great time in my life, and then I saw that story and I was able to make some choices in my life, and it did this for me. So thank you for telling that story. I never heard that one before. And I'll hear things like that, and I'll think, well, that's great, but when I was telling that story, I was really angry. I was telling that story angrily that night. So I think that the listener hears what they need to hear in that moment. And the storyteller, myself or whoever it may be, just tells it in the best way that their humanness will let them in that moment. So I think that that's the beauty of the stories, is that the knowledge of our ancestors are still interweaved, even though you're feeling happy, sad, angry. It's the knowledge is still interweaved in it, and it still compounds itself out into the listening public.
Indigenous characters have become ingrained into pop culture. We see them everywhere. They're so common, we might not even be aware of them. For example, this is a description of the coyote in Indigenous culture. He's a trickster, native to North America. He's always hungry, often killed but never dies, dislikes work, spends time thinking up schemes to outsmart his enemy, but usually outsmarts himself, is referred to as the Wile E. Coyote, which is similar to Wile E. Coyote from Warner Brothers' Looney Tunes. He first appeared in a 1949 cartoon called Fast and Furious. Coyote's a trickster who's always hungry, chasing the roadrunner. He's often killed but never dies, spends time thinking up schemes to outsmart his enemy, but usually outsmarts himself. And if you were curious, the E in Wile E. Coyote stands for Ethelbert. Another famous animal character from Indigenous stories is the mouse, famous today in many cartoons and theme parks. Do you find coyotes probably the character that most people relate to?
I think they relate to everyone, all of them, all of the animal people and all of the people that play a part in these Jabdequas. They all have a very humanness, but they also have a very whatever animal part they are. They're all very relatable to anyone in any given moment. Coyote's just a way to show us how not to behave. Yeah, so when we watch him do bizarre, inane acts, and especially in the older stories where he's very, it's very gratuitous in the older stories, you see that and you go, geez, I would never want to be like that. So yeah, I guess in a way it's a way of really teaching us and showing us how not to behave and what the consequences are of behaving like a coyote, running around and impregnating girls all over the Turtle Island and tricking people and getting your ill-gotten gains and what happens to you if you flaunt them and you show them off, and then you get your just rewards, such as a possible death or a killing, murder. But Coyote never really has to face his consequences because he always gets brought back to life, or he finds a way to move on and to get beyond that and to get healed up somehow.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because we talk about that with not flaunting and not gloating and things. And I feel like in our society today, that's kind of shifted. All of a sudden now we have this fascination for people like Bill Gates or Elon Musk that have these billions of dollars, and it's all posted everywhere. We all know it, and we see the kind of wealth, and Jeff Bezos with his mansions in Hawaii. And
well, yeah, because in the stories, Coyote shows off, and then he has to face the consequence. But today, we can write a post, or we can do a TikTok, or we can do something, and we can show off our hundreds of thousands of dollars and show it off. And sometimes the consequences are for the most part in today's society, they're good. The consequences aren't what they it may be over time, the consequences of that action befall you, but for the moment. And that's what I think today's society is all about, is we're kind of a now society. We don't think about what the consequences, what might be. We always hear the joke, oh, that's going to be Kenny's problem tomorrow. And then we all laugh it away. But the consequences don't seem like, for that kind of behavior, as strident or as punitive as they once were. So I think a lot of people feel like they can get away with that kind of stuff. They can get away with writing something mean about someone and doing all that. So I tell that when I do tell that story, when I do introduce myself, and when I talk about what kind of stories I'm going to be telling today, I make mention of that. I say, and the second lesson that you'll be learning in today's story is about how not to behave, which I feel like is really important, especially in today's climate, where you can make fun of someone on the other side of a screen, where you can belittle someone on the other side of a screen, where you can say something about someone's family or their presence on the other side of a screen and not have any repercussions. The only repercussions might be an FU, or you get blocked or deleted. And what kind of consequences are those? They're not really punitive. They're not really rememberful. They're not really, they're forgetful. And to some people, they're laughable. So I think, especially in today's climate, our tikwa are vitally important, so people can realize and look at these stories and go, geez, I don't want to end up like that. I want to live in a good and kind way.
Yeah, we got to see some consequences happen to coyote these days. We're not seeing it anymore.
Yeah, exactly.